In every moment, you choose who you want to be and how you want to live your life. That is your ultimate power and your inescapable responsibility. You are the master of your reality. It doesn't always feel that way, though, right? I mean, too often we believe the awful fictions of our fears. We believe our self-limiting assumptions. We misperceive success and value in our lives. We misperceive the force of luck. We perpetuate insecurities and vanities, and we fail to listen to each other and to our own hearts. So how do we take back control, living our lives with awareness and purpose? That's the question we consider generally in this interview series, Mastering Your Reality. Now today we're going to talk a little bit more about the neuroscience behind all this and our minds. And we're going to try to draw some parallels between this sort of human experience where we are the masters of our own realities. We create our realities, even though sometimes it feels like the reality is something out there beyond our control, something that is imposed upon us. We're going to try to draw a parallel between that idea and the way in which the human mind, human cognition itself evolved. How did this brain of ours come to be? Our guest is Professor Kevin Laland, who is a highly accomplished professor of behavioral and evolutionary biology at the University of St. Andrews. Professor Laland has published more than 230 scientific articles and more than a dozen books on subjects of animal behavior and evolution. In particular, he's spent decades thinking about the question of social learning and cultural evolution. He has become quite the expert on the subject. And in his new book, he presents the culmination of a lot of that work so far in what is a new theory of cognitive evolution, a new explanation of how it is that our minds developed. The book is called Darwin's Unfinished Symphony, How Culture Shaped the Human Mind. Professor Laland, thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Isaac. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I want to make sure we start from the basics here. Before
Sure.
we dive into sort of the unfinished part of the symphony, so to speak, can we get a sort of a basic primer, a basic understanding of the sort of classical Darwinian model of evolution?
Sure. Let me put this in context a little bit. So as you say, I'm an evolutionary biologist and a scientist, and I study the evolution of the human mind and the associated origins of intelligence, creativity, language, and culture. And what makes this a particularly interesting and yet at the same time challenging topic for an evolutionary biologist is the fact that we humans appear so different from the rest of nature. We are in many respects a truly remarkable species, and I think it's worth dwelling on that for a second. I mean, just think about our numbers. We exist at densities that way exceed what would be typical for an animal of our size by several orders of magnitude. We have managed to spread out and forge a living over sort of virtually every inch of the globe, at least every inch of the terrestrial globe, including some incredibly inhospitable regions like the Arctic and the deserts. And we have these amazing accomplishments
like Boston in the winter.
Pardon?
And like Boston in the winter.
Well, exactly. So we look unusual by any standard, and of course, evolutionary biology as a field is one that thrives on continuity. We explain the evolution of trait A in terms of its pre-existence as trait B. Discontinuity makes us uncomfortable. We need to somehow make sense of why we look so different and do so using standard scientific terms. And that really is what my goal, my research is about. When I talk about Darwin's Unfinished Symphony, that's the label I give for the challenge of trying to understand the evolutionary origins of the mind and its expression in culture, because Darwin, of course, began the investigation of these topics, but he himself acknowledged that his understanding of these was incomplete and fragmentary. And since that time, of course, evolutionary biologists have sort of picked up the baton and run with it, and we're gaining a much richer understanding of these issues. And I think it's exciting times for this field because many of us feel like we're coming towards a reasonable understanding of how we can make sense of that. But it's a much richer story when it comes to understanding the evolution of the mind than you might get in your evolutionary biology 101, as you were saying. We're not thinking in terms of organisms which vary because of random mutation, being sort of buffeted around by the external forces of selection. Organisms are playing a much more active role in their own evolutionary dynamics, and if we want to understand the truly unique aspects of humanity, our intelligence, our large brains, our language, our huge level of cooperation, these are not things that we can really make sense of as adaptive responses to external conditions like predation or disease, but rather they are evolutionary responses to things that we ourselves made, to our culture, our behavior, and the complexities of our society.
Let me take a crack at rephrasing that and see if I'm making any sense, or if I'm understanding you.
Mm-hmm.
So Darwin says, in a nutshell, you have these random mutations at the genetic level that over hundreds of millions of years, some prove helpful, those survive, others are unhelpful, those die off. And, on just huge time scales, this is how organisms make their way, out of the seas onto land and develop and all that kind of stuff. And that's great and all, and that happens, no doubt. Yet, about 200,000 years ago, we were essentially apes that could walk upright and, maybe use spears or some other sort of stone tools. And in 200,000 years, we've got, Facebook and Twitter and man on the moon and all the amazing things that make us different, as you say. This sort of random mutation model, the classical Darwinian model, can't explain that. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Kind of. I mean, I think I would put it in a slightly more nuanced way than that. I mean, for sure, there's random mutation, which is generating the variation upon which selection acts, but we have to also acknowledge additional sources of variation that might be operating in these systems. There's cultural variation, there's epigenetic variation, there are other sources of variation that impact on the phenotypes that are subject to selection. But also the selective process itself is not solely controlled by a sort of external environment.
Right.
Organisms, and this is not peculiar to humans, by the way, organisms in general will control important aspects of their world. They'll regulate those aspects under specified conditions. I mean, we can see examples of this all over the place. So
Can you give us a few?
think about a bird building a nest. Why does it do that? Well, it wants to regulate an important aspect of its world. It wants to lay some eggs and rear some chicks. It's important that the developmental environment for those chicks is appropriate for them, the right temperature, the right level of humidity. You want to keep those animals safe. So by building a nest, you control that environment and ensure that the offspring experience suitable conditions. And this is a very general feature of life. It's a feature known as niche construction. All kinds of animals are building nests, they're constructing mounds, they're digging burrows, they're spinning webs, and these are all attempts to control and regulate aspects of their world.
And is the idea that there's a feedback between that and sort of genetic evolution or development?
Exactly, because how you evolve depends on the nature of selection that's acting on you. So
in other words, a chick evolves.
If you build a nest,
right,
then you are controlling the temperature to which the eggs are subjected. So it will influence the selection of alleles that are influenced in, regulation of the development in different temperatures and so on and so forth.
So it's not optimal configuration to survive in a purely natural world. It's optimally configured to survive in the world as it's been augmented by the species itself.
You want to do anything you can to I mean, I'm thinking in loose cognitive terms here, but I mean, we shouldn't place too much emphasis on the word want.
Deliberate, yeah.
I'm not using it in a cognitive sense, but it benefits the organism to regulate its world in a way which will enhance its survival and reproduction. And this is not peculiar even to animals. I mean, let me give you an example from the plant world, just again to illustrate the generality of this. One of my favorite examples of niche construction concerns this plant called the desert rhubarb, which is found in the Negev desert in Israel. And unlike most desert plants, it has these huge fleshy leaves with these great thick veins. And of course, most desert plants have got tiny leaves, or they have spines instead of leaves to ensure they don't suffer too much water loss. But what these big leaves allow the desert rhubarb to do is collect any water that does occur when it rains and channel it down to its taproot, which kind of grows and then shrinks a little bit, creating a little cavity in which all this water gathers. And in the process, it kind of creates a little kind of miniature oasis in the vicinity of its own roots. So if you were to measure the water level in the surrounding soil, you'd find one level. In the vicinity of the plant itself, it's 6 times that. It's created a kind of Mediterranean environment in the desert.
It's beautiful.
So, this is a good example of what animals and plants do. They will regulate their world. They will construct important components of their environments, and then that will influence how natural selection acts on them.
Okay, so I think this might be a good point to ask the question: what makes us human? What's the special sauce, so to speak? What's the culture driver that has made us, as you said, unique?
Yeah, so humans are not unique in their capability to engage in this environmental regulation. We just happen to be particularly good at it. And we're particularly good at it because of our culture. Now, to explain how you go from that to the evolution of the human mind and our intelligence and our large brains is quite a long and convoluted story. But I can have a go at giving you a sort of a précis of it. Mm-hmm. So if you think about our success as a species, I attribute that to our capacity for culture. And when I use the term culture, I'm talking about our ability to acquire knowledge and skills from other individuals, social learning, to invent novel solutions, which are propagated, which is innovation, and then to build on those solutions repeatedly in a kind of iterative fashion, which is known as cumulative culture. So if we want to understand the evolutionary origins of culture, then it makes sense to study innovation and social learning in animals, and that's something that we've done for many years. Now, of course, some people would have it that animals don't innovate, they're not creative. In fact, that couldn't be further from the truth. It's only since we've been studying animals for many, many years that we get a good understanding of their natural behavior, that we can kind of use that as a baseline to detect departures from the norm and see that they actually innovate all the time. To give you an example, there's this wonderful, charming example of these Japanese crows that have invented the habit of using cars as nutcrackers. So they have these nuts which are too tough to break with their bills. So they'll put them on the road, and then the cars run them over, and then they go and retrieve the nuts.
That's awesome.
It's very cool.
That's awesome.
Another example, which is one of my favorites, is one of Jane Goodall's chimpanzees called Mike, who invented the habit of supplementing his dominance display with 2 empty kerosene cans. So he banged these cans together, which made this huge display, this really loud display that intimidated his rivals, and he shot up the dominance rankings. So animals are really clever. They'll come up with new solutions to their problems, and oftentimes these are foraging challenges. They'll invent new ways of processing foods and exploiting them, and these will spread through their populations. We have documented evidence for a lot of this going on very widely in the animal community. Now, if you look at the rate at which animals innovate and engage in social learning, not all animals are equal. Some animals are doing more of it than others. So, for instance, we've looked at the rates of innovation and social learning across primates, non-human primates. And we find something interesting, which is a correlation between innovation and social learning rates and brain size. So big-brained species of primates are inventing more new behaviors, and they're copying each other more than our small-brained species of primates. Now, we think that's no coincidence for various reasons. We think it reflects selection for accurate, efficient copying, which is driving brain evolution. You know, if there's selection for efficient copying, we know that there is because of computational analyses which suggest that this ought to be going on. We can envisage that this would favor certain structures in the primate brain, better perceptual systems if that allows you to copy over greater distances, or integration across modular structures in the brain if that allows you to take in visual inputs and translate that into motor outputs, which is necessary if you're going to imitate other individuals successfully, and so on and so forth. So we can anticipate that there would be an impact of that selection in the structures and cognitive capabilities of the animal's brains, and that this would inadvertently be expressed in larger brains and would feed back to further enhance the social learning and innovative capabilities of the animal in a sort of runaway autocatalytic process that we can envisage as kind of climaxed in our own species, the most innovative, the most culturally reliant animal with the largest relative brain size amongst primates. So we think that this selection for social learning has been driving the evolution of the large brain and evolution of intelligence in primates. And there's a lot of evidence consistent with that, comparative evidence. So those species that are good at social learning also happen to be the ones that use tools the most, that have the broadest diet, that live the longest lives, that are best performers in laboratory tests of learning and cognition, that happen to be the most intelligent. So that's, in a sense, step one of the argument I make here. So the selection for social learning, for efficient, accurate social learning, has driven the evolution of the primate large brain and our intelligence. But then you can then ask, well, okay, in that case, if this is going on widely, why haven't chimpanzees put chimpanzees on the moon? Why haven't gorillas invented Facebook? And the answer that I give to that is that those other species never evolved sufficiently accurate means of information transmission. And the reason we think that is because of mathematical analyses we've done, which have explored the relationship between the accuracy of information transmission and how long cultural traits will remain in a population. And you get a kind of acceleratory relationship such that above a certain threshold, a small increase in the accuracy of information. And remember, we've got evidence from our analyses that selection should favor more accurate forms of information transmission. A small increase in the accuracy of information corresponds to a big increase, firstly, in how long a cultural trait will stay in a population. And as a knock-on consequence of that, to how many cultural traits, how much culture you find in that population. Now, of course, as humans, we're totally swamped with culture. So it's hard for us to think in terms of the amount of culture. It doesn't really make sense. But in other animals, it makes more sense. We can talk about animals having 2 or 3 or 4 cultural traits that they propagate, and some have dozens or hundreds even. And that corresponds with, that fits very tightly with the theory, because we have a large number of species that are capable of learning from each other, but using very inaccurate forms of copying. And those tend to be the ones that have very few cultural traits, that don't last very long. And we have other species like chimpanzees, which are much better at copying. They have more sophisticated forms of copying, like imitation and emulation, and they have more cultural traits which last longer. Humans, of course, have the highest fidelity cultural transmission, and we have huge amounts of potentially, at least, very long-lasting culture. And this helps us to understand how we get the cumulative culture too, a culture that sort of ratchets up in complexity and diversity, because again, theoretical analyses that we've done suggest that it's only when you pass a certain threshold in accuracy of information transmission that you can get cultures that ratchet up in complexity. Below that threshold, it's really hard to get cumulative culture off the ground. But once you pass that threshold, even very modest amounts of innovation and sort of recombination of existing cultural traits rapidly lead to this massive build-up of cumulative culture. So that's the second step in the argument then, that accurate, high-fidelity copying is what drives the evolution of rich, complex culture. And then when you have this rich, complex, cumulative culture, if you think back not 200,000 years, but perhaps a couple of million years, our ancestors would have had a broad cultural repertoire where there were all kinds of different foraging skills that have been transmitted. They would have been engaged in some hunting and scavenging. They'd need to learn the methods associated with that. They'd be manufacturing a certain number of different tools. They have to engage in all kinds of different forms of food preparation and food processing. All of these things would need to be learned, and they were typically learned socially. Well, that creates a context in which it's advantageous to teach. And we have evidence, both empirical and theoretical, that teaching makes cumulative culture more likely, and they reinforce each other because cumulative culture, in turn, makes teaching more likely. And once you have, as we anticipate, we would have found amongst our ancestors a species for the first time that's heavily reliant on teaching its close relatives, all these foraging skills and scavenging skills and tool manufacturing skills. Then you create the selection pressure, where there it becomes advantageous for a really cheap and accurate form of teaching, which is what language originally was. That's why we think language originally appeared as a means to teach close relatives accurately and cheaply. I mean, telling someone where the food is a lot cheaper than taking them there and showing them that. Instructing someone that the red berries are poisonous is a lot easier than trying to get that across through some other means. It's a cheap means of instruction, but it's also an accurate means of information. We can get messages across with far greater fidelity through language than we can through other means. So that's why we think language evolved as a kind of adaptive response to facilitate teaching. Teaching, in turn, was an adaptation to enhance cumulative culture. Cumulative culture appears as a consequence of high-fidelity information transmission. So you can see these feedback loops, which are operating throughout the history of our species. And you can go further. You can talk in terms of the large-scale cooperation that we see inherent in human societies, which is really quite extraordinary and out of kilter with anything we see in the rest of nature. That is heavily reliant on the teaching and the language, those capabilities that we have, and the means by which that allows us to develop the norms and the laws and the regulations that underpin our society. So we wouldn't have complex societies without our language and teaching. We wouldn't have that without our cumulative culture. We wouldn't have that without our high-fidelity information transmission, and so on and so on. So all of this is a kind of cycle.
So is it fair to say that we are who we are? We've developed our cognitive capacity in large part because of our ability to learn from each other, our instinct to teach each other, as underlied by language, our ability to communicate with each other.
That's exactly right. Yes.
That's a pretty beautiful thing.
That's a beautiful thing. I mean, I think people would, with a more traditional belt, would think of these things, our language, our culture, our teaching, as outcomes of the evolutionary process. Right. But in fact, they probably were cause of the evolutionary process.
Yeah, and in a feedback.
We can see, we have hard evidence that this kind of thing is going on if we in essence look inside the human genome. Since the genome was sequenced, statistically minded geneticists have developed these tools to recognize regions of the genome that have been subject to recent selection. And it turns out there's quite a few of these. These are if you like, gene variants that means subject to selection over the last 10,000, 30,000, 40,000 years. When we look at what those genes do, they often seem to be tied to human cultural activities. So things like our ancestors' domestication of plants and animals and incorporation of these novel dietary elements into their diets impose selection on the digestive enzymes, favoring alleles that allow them to, gene variants that allow them to metabolize those novel foods. So we have a lot more starch in our diets than historically our hunter-gatherer ancestors. That generates selection for gene variants that will have multiple copies of alleles that produce the enzyme amylase in our saliva and our pancreas, which allow us to break down those starches. In societies that have a history of pastoralism and dairy farming, they have a gene variant which allows them to produce lactase as an adult, which will allow them to break down the lactose, the sugar-rich substance that we find in milk and dairy products, and exploit that energy source. So our cultural activities impose selection on our genes and trigger adaptive evolutionary responses.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but do you buy the idea that there's kind of a parallel to the way we experience the world, in the sense of it's less something out there that sort of shapes what we think and feel, our behavior, but more about our own power, our own mind to learn, to communicate, and to decide how we are going to allow those circumstances beyond us to sort of manifest themselves in our lives?
That makes a lot of intuitive sense to me, and it fits with my understanding of the world. I mean, I have to preface what I say with acknowledging I'm not a psychoanalyst or a self-help guru. I'm not qualified to tell people how to lead their lives. But
I'm not either, and I'm also not an evolutionary biologist. So you have me beat by far.
but I think we can look to nature as a source of inspiration, and we can see that we're all the descendants of a long line of organisms that successfully controlled and regulated their worlds. I like to think of evolution as a process that's it's analogous to sort of walking on a trampoline. You deform the surface as you move. You change your world, and that then feeds back to influence your subsequent trajectory. And it seems to me that's a pretty good analogy for our lives as well, our development. We also transform our world through our activities, and we have to do that. Whether we choose to do that, whether we're conscious of doing that or not, we have to do that. And so we might as well seize the day, as far as I'm concerned. We might as well make the most of it, because it's happening anyway.
It warms my heart to hear those words come out of a mind like yours. And I think that has to be where we leave it for now. I'd love to speak to you again at some point. I've enjoyed this thoroughly, Professor Laland.
It's a great pleasure.
Thank you
very much. Cheers.